They noticed her name long before they noticed her story. Buried inside White House ledgers from 1861 to 1865, among generals, cabinet members, and paid staff, one name appeared again and again in places it should not have been. Not in payroll lists, not in official appointments, but inside the private living quarters of the President of the United States. Elizabeth Keckley. She had no government title. She received no federal salary. She signed no official letters. And yet she was present during moments that shaped the fate of a nation. She stood in rooms where war was decided. She heard conversations that never reached paper. She watched grief consume the most powerful family in America from the inside. And when she finally spoke in 1868, the reaction was so violent, so coordinated, that her words were almost erased from history itself. Most copies of her book were quietly purchased and destroyed. And Elizabeth Keckley never spoke again. For 40 years, the question whispered in Washington parlors for decades was simple and terrifying. What else did she know? Before we continue, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because this story was buried on purpose. And in the comments, tell me what state you are listening from. I want to know where the truth seekers are tonight. Now let us begin. The needle moved through silk with perfect control. Each stitch was invisible, each movement exact. Elizabeth Keckley had learned precision the hard way. In a Virginia plantation house where mistakes were punished with pain. Where a young enslaved girl learned that steady hands meant survival. Where scars formed lessons and silence was protection. Even decades later, faint white marks still crossed her knuckles. She learned how to position her hands so no one would notice. By 1860, Elizabeth was a free woman. 37 years old, living in Washington, D.C., running a respectable dressmaking business on 12th Street. Her shop smelled of lavender and clean cotton, carefully chosen to hide the constant coal smoke hanging over the city. Outside her windows, Washington was changing. It was no longer a quiet southern town. It was becoming the center of a nation tearing itself apart. November 1860, South Carolina was threatening to leave the Union. Other slave states were watching closely. Newspapers screamed about betrayal and blood. Men in fine suits argued over slavery while promising war. And Abraham Lincoln, an awkward lawyer from Illinois, had just been elected president by a country that half rejected him. Elizabeth had bought her freedom stitch by stitch. Dollar by painful dollar. She paid $1,200 for herself and her son George. 17 years of sewing late into the night. Eyes strained by lamplight. Hands swollen and bleeding, sewing dresses for women who trusted her with their bodies but refused to see her as human. She arrived in Washington with letters of recommendation and a reputation that crossed color lines even when society refused to. Within months she was dressing senators' wives and generals' families. Women who praised her skill while never offering her a chair. Women who spoke openly about race while she knelt at their feet pinning hems. Elizabeth never reacted. She had mastered a dangerous skill. Being present but invisible, hearing everything while appearing to hear nothing. Then one cold afternoon in February 1861, the door chimes rang. Mary Todd Lincoln entered her shop like a storm wrapped in silk. Nervous energy filled the room. Her wide skirts brushed furniture aside. Her eyes darted constantly, searching, judging. She was smaller than expected. Round-faced, pretty beneath the tension. A woman permanently braced for criticism. Mrs. Keckley, she said. I am told you are the finest dressmaker in Washington. I need an entire wardrobe. Everything. State dinners, receptions, morning calls, evening entertainments. My husband is about to become President of the United States. Elizabeth noticed the scent of rose water. And beneath it, something bitter. Laudanum, a common medicine, and a dangerous one. But here is the problem, Mary continued. I need to look like I belong in the White House. And I need you to do it on a budget that would not dress a senator's wife for a single season. Can you do that? Elizabeth answered calmly. I will do my best. That moment changed her life. What began as business became something else. Not friendship. The space between them was too wide. But intimacy grew from proximity. From long hours alone. From tears witnessed. From secrets shared. Elizabeth would spend more time in the White House private quarters than most cabinet members. She would hold Mary Lincoln through grief that shattered her sanity. She would see Abraham Lincoln broken by war, reduced to raw sorrow by the weight of dead sons he never met. She would hear arguments never recorded, decisions never written, fear never admitted. The White House in 1861 was not secure. Citizens walked its halls freely. Petitioners crowded rooms from dawn to night. The president's office sat steps away from his family's bedrooms. There were no clear boundaries. Public and private bled together. Mary Lincoln redecorated obsessively, spending money not approved, making choices that would later destroy her reputation. And Elizabeth Keckley was there for all of it. Watching, listening, remembering. And that was only the beginning. If this story gripped you, subscribe, share it with someone who loves hidden history, and leave a comment below. Part 2 reveals what Elizabeth saw behind closed doors during the first days of the Civil War. Part 2. Elizabeth Keckley would later realize that Mary Lincoln's spending was not vanity. It was survival. In a world collapsing under gunfire and betrayal, silk and china were the only things Mary could still control. Drapes, carpets, furniture, dresses. Each purchase was an attempt to build order while the nation unraveled. They were standing close during an early fitting, Mary in her undergarments, Elizabeth working quickly with pins held between her lips. "The newspapers call me a traitor," Mary said suddenly. "Because I was born in Kentucky. They say I support the Confederacy. They say I pass secrets to the South. That I cannot be trusted because my family owns slaves." Elizabeth did not look up. Her fingers moved smoothly, professional, silent. "My brothers are fighting for the South," Mary continued. "3 of them. One will die at Baton Rouge. Another at Vicksburg. Another at Chickamauga. And people ask why I cannot sleep. Why I need medicine just to make it through the day." Elizabeth said nothing, but she remembered everything. She was learning something important. Mary Lincoln needed to talk. She needed someone who would listen without judgment. Someone who would not repeat her words. Someone who could not afford to betray her. Elizabeth Keckley was that person. Slavery had trained her perfectly for this role. To be invisible. To hear everything. To keep secrets that could destroy powerful people. By the summer of 1861, Washington felt sick. The war arrived like a fever. Soldiers flooded the streets. Boys in fresh uniforms laughed and joked, still believing the war would end quickly. Hospitals filled churches and schools. The Potomac River carried supplies and bodies. Drums echoed day and night. The White House became a guarded fortress. Soldiers stood at every entrance. Sharpshooters watched rooftops. Fear settled into every room. Elizabeth saw the president change. Abraham Lincoln arrived in Washington awkward and unsure. He told jokes when he was nervous. His clothes never quite fit. Eastern elites mocked his accent and posture. But war reshaped him. Within months his face aged years. His eyes darkened. His shoulders slumped under invisible weight. Each casualty report carved deeper lines into his skin. One evening in August 1861, Elizabeth was adjusting a gown in Mary's private sitting room when the door opened suddenly. The president entered. He did not notice Elizabeth. She stood still, holding silk and thread, unseen. "It is a disaster," Lincoln said. "Bull Run. A complete disaster." His voice sounded hollow. "We thought it would be quick. A show of force. Congressmen went to watch with picnic baskets. Like it was a game." He stopped and rubbed his face. "Our boys ran. They broke and ran. And now McDowell wants more men. More time. More everything. And I do not know if the nation has more to give." Mary crossed the room immediately. She guided him into a chair. Her touch was gentle, her voice calm. "You will find a way," she said. "You always do." Lincoln looked up. Elizabeth saw terror in his eyes. "I am sending boys to die," he said. 18 and 19-year-olds. Farm boys who never left home. For what? To force states to stay in a union they voted to leave. He lowered his voice. "Sometimes I wonder if I am the tyrant they say I am. If history will remember me as the man who destroyed the republic to save it." Elizabeth's hands froze. She was hearing something forbidden. Mary answered without hesitation. "You are preserving the nation. And ending slavery. Do not forget that." Lincoln was silent for a long moment. "I cannot make it about slavery yet," he said quietly. Not publicly. The border states would revolt. Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, Delaware, we would lose them, and then we would lose the war. I have to wait for the right moment. The right victory. He exhaled. Frederick Douglass calls me a coward. Maybe he is right. Elizabeth felt something twist inside her. She knew slavery was the heart of the war. It had owned her body for 33 years. But hearing it spoken of as strategy rather than moral urgency filled her with bitter understanding. This was how power worked. Not through justice. Through timing. Elizabeth never told Mary Lincoln the truth of her past. She never spoke of her birth in Virginia. Of her white father who never acknowledged her. Of being loaned at 14 to a man who abused her for 4 years. Of her son George born of violence. She never told her about the beatings meant to break her spirit. About fingers bleeding onto silk. About 17 years sewing to buy her own body back. 17 years working to stop being property. She carried those truths alone. And now she carried the truths of the President of the United States. Secrets layered upon secrets. By the end of 1861, Elizabeth Keckley was no longer just a dressmaker. She was a witness. And witnesses rarely survive unchanged. If this story is gripping you, subscribe to this channel, share it with someone who loves hidden history, and leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. In Part 3, grief enters the White House and nothing will ever be the same. Part 3, some secrets rot the soul of the person who keeps them. Others protect entire nations. Elizabeth Keckley was learning the difference. The Lincolns knew she had been a slave. That part of her story was safe. It fit the narrative people liked to tell themselves. The noble woman who rose through talent and hard work. The success story that made white society feel generous rather than guilty. But they did not know the texture of it. They did not know the fear that lived in ordinary days. The humiliation that arrived quietly. The discipline required to stand silent in a corner while the President of the United States questioned his own sanity. Elizabeth had been shaped for this role long before she entered the White House. Autumn of 1861 brought a deeper tension to Washington. The early excitement of war had faded. This was not going to be quick. The casualty lists grew longer. Ambulance wagons rattled through streets day and night. Churches turned into hospitals. Young men entered Washington laughing and left it broken or dead. And Mary Lincoln began spending faster than ever. It was not joy. It was desperation. One October afternoon, Elizabeth was fitting Mary for a new gown when the First Lady suddenly grabbed her wrist. Her grip was shockingly strong. Fingernails dug into skin. "I have to tell you something," Mary whispered. "Something I cannot tell anyone else. Will you swear to keep it secret?" Elizabeth hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Yes, Mrs. Lincoln." Mary's eyes shone with panic. "I am in terrible debt. Over $27,000. Congress only approved $20,000. I have hidden bills, lied to merchants. If Abraham finds out, if the newspapers find out, they will destroy me." Her voice cracked. "And they will be right. I cannot stop myself. If I stop buying things, if I sit still, I will have to think about my brothers fighting my husband. About half the country hating me. About losing everything." Elizabeth felt anger rise and forced it down. Mary had spent in 1 year what Elizabeth had taken 17 years to earn for her freedom. And yet Elizabeth felt pity. Mary Lincoln was enslaved too. Not by chains, but by fear, by judgment, by grief. "I will help you however I can," Elizabeth said. She had no idea what that promise would cost her. Then came February 1862. The real horror arrived quietly. Willie Lincoln fell ill. At first it seemed harmless. A cold, a fever. But the fever rose. Days passed. Doctors whispered. The word bilious appeared. Later history would call it typhoid. The White House water came from the Potomac downstream from sewage. Elizabeth was there the night Willie died. February 20, 1862. Mary had insisted on a fitting that evening. As if fabric could distract death. When Elizabeth arrived, the house felt wrong. Heavy. Doctors stood helpless. Servants avoided eye contact. When Willie died, Mary made a sound Elizabeth would never forget. It was not a scream. It was older than language. A sound that filled the White House and soaked into its walls. The president carried his wife from the room. This tall awkward man cradled her like a child. His face aged before Elizabeth's eyes. "You must control yourself, Mary," he said, his voice breaking. "Or you will go mad." She did not recover. Not truly. Grief hollowed her out. She could not enter the room where Willie died. She accused staff of theft. She clung to Elizabeth like a lifeline. Elizabeth became her anchor. And the secrets grew darker. By spring 1862, Mary wore only black. During a fitting one afternoon, she seized Elizabeth's hand. "I have been attending seances," Mary whispered. "A medium comes to the White House. I have spoken to Willie." Elizabeth felt her heart drop. "He says he is at peace," Mary continued. "He tells me to stop grieving." Elizabeth kept her face still. "Does the president know?" "He attends sometimes. He does not believe, but he allows it." Mary's grip tightened. "The medium says there are people in the White House who want Abraham dead. Conspirators. Traitors. She has given me names." A chill ran through Elizabeth. "Mrs. Lincoln, perhaps these seances are not wise." Mary pulled away sharply. "You think I am mad. Everyone thinks that, but I know what I know. There are secrets here, dangerous ones, and when the war is over, they will try to destroy us." The words hung between them. Elizabeth did not ask which secrets. Some knowledge was too dangerous to hold. Then in September 1862, the Emancipation Proclamation was announced. Elizabeth read it alone in her shop. She cried. It did not free everyone. It did not erase centuries of violence. But it was something, a crack in the wall. The next day at the White House, she found the president standing by a window. "Mrs. Keckley," he said, "you were born a slave." "Yes, Mr. President. And you bought your freedom." "Yes, sir. 17 years. Lincoln stared out at the city. "I have signed a paper that may free millions. But I wonder if paper can change hearts." Elizabeth answered carefully. "Paper gave me freedom, but it did not make me free. That I had to do myself. Every day." Lincoln nodded slowly. He never forgot that answer. And neither did Elizabeth, because she knew something most people did not. Freedom was fragile, and the White House was full of ghosts. If this story pulled you in, subscribe to this channel, share it with someone who loves hidden history, and leave a comment telling me where you are listening from. In Part 4, suspicion spreads through the White House, and Elizabeth hears a warning she was never meant to hear. Part 4. By the middle of 1863, the White House no longer felt like a home. It felt like a haunted house. Grief had settled into its walls. Fear crept through its corridors. Every footstep echoed too loudly. Every knock at the door carried the possibility of disaster. Elizabeth Keckley sensed it before anyone spoke of it openly. The war had grown monstrous. Casualty lists stretched across newspaper columns like endless funeral prayers. Gettysburg and Antietam left the nation stunned. Entire towns lost their sons in a single week. The smell of death followed soldiers back into Washington, clinging to their uniforms and boots. And inside the White House, suspicion began to grow. Mary Lincoln slept poorly, when she slept at all. She startled at sounds. She accused servants of listening at doors. She asked Elizabeth the same questions again and again, as if testing her loyalty. "You would tell me if you heard something strange, would you, Elizabeth?" "Of course, Mrs. Lincoln. You would warn me if someone meant harm to the president." "Yes, Mrs. Lincoln." Elizabeth felt the weight of each answer settle deeper into her chest. She had become more than a witness. She was now a shield. Strangers passed through the White House daily. Politicians, military officers, clerks, petitioners, some loyal, some bitter, some desperate enough to do terrible things. Elizabeth heard things while pinning hems and adjusting seams. Men whispered about Lincoln being too slow, too soft, too radical, too dangerous. Others whispered the opposite, that he was a tyrant, a butcher, a dictator hiding behind law. One afternoon, while Elizabeth worked quietly in a side room near Mary's chambers, two men spoke in low voices in the hallway. They did not know she was there. "This war will end him," one said. "Or someone else will," the other replied. Elizabeth's hands did not shake. She had learned long ago how to hide fear. The president himself seemed to sense the tightening circle. He rarely traveled without guards now. Soldiers shadowed his walks. Even so, he refused to isolate himself completely. "I cannot rule from behind locked doors," he once said within Elizabeth's hearing. A frightened president frightens the nation. Still, danger pressed closer. In the summer of 1863, Mary's paranoia deepened. She was convinced letters were being intercepted, that servants were bribed, that someone within the household was feeding information to enemies. One evening she grabbed Elizabeth's arm hard enough to bruise. "Promise me, Elizabeth. Promise me you will never repeat anything you hear in this house. Not to anyone, ever." "I promise." Elizabeth meant it, but promises could become prisons. The First Lady had begun speaking openly of threats, of warnings she claimed to receive, of dreams that felt like premonitions. "I see him falling," Mary whispered once. "Blood everywhere. I wake screaming." Elizabeth said nothing. She had learned that sometimes silence was mercy. Then came the letter. Elizabeth found it by accident, tucked beneath a pile of fabric scraps in a small sitting room used by staff. It had no name, no seal, just a few lines written in sharp uneven handwriting. "He walks among the people too freely. Justice will come. The tyrant will fall." Elizabeth stared at the words until they blurred. She did not know who wrote it. She did not know who it was meant for. But she knew it was dangerous. Her first instinct was to take it to the president. Her second was to burn it. Instead, she did nothing. That choice would haunt her. The night she told Mary about the letter, the First Lady went pale. "You see," Mary whispered. "I told you. They are everywhere." Elizabeth tried to calm her. "It could be nothing. An angry citizen. A foolish threat." Mary shook her head. "No, it is real. I feel it." From that night on, Mary slept with the lights on. Elizabeth often stayed late, pretending to adjust garments, simply to keep her company. The president noticed. "You have been very kind to my wife, Mrs. Keckley," he said once. "She needs someone she trusts," Elizabeth replied. He studied her carefully. "So do we all." The war dragged on. Victories came at terrible cost. Emancipation became law. Slavery was dying, but it was dying violently. And hatred grew sharper. Elizabeth heard rumors of plots. Some vague, some chillingly specific. Men swore Lincoln would not live to see peace. He himself seemed resigned to it. "If this war ends as it should," he once said quietly, "I will be satisfied if I can slip quietly out of life afterward." Elizabeth did not like the way he said it. In early 1864, security tightened further. Guards doubled. Routes changed. Warnings ignored. Mary begged him to be careful. Abraham only smiled. "I have no desire to live if I am too afraid to do my duty." Elizabeth understood then. Some people sense their end long before it arrives. She carried that understanding like a stone in her stomach. The White House felt colder now. Even in summer. As if something waited patiently. And Elizabeth Keckley knew something else. When the moment came, when the darkness finally struck, history would remember the president. It would remember the assassin. It would remember the war. But it would forget the woman who stood silently nearby, holding secrets that might have changed everything. If this story keeps you listening, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who loves hidden history, and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. In Part 5, the warning signs become impossible to ignore, and Elizabeth is faced with a choice she can never undo. Some nights, the White House seemed alive. Not with laughter or conversation, but with whispers. Shadows that moved where no one stood. A cold draft in a sealed room. Footsteps that paused outside doors, then vanished. Elizabeth Keckley had spent decades learning how to survive in silence. But by the spring of 1864, even she could not ignore the sense that danger had crept closer than ever. The war had become an endless drumbeat of death and destruction. Gettysburg was months behind, but its ghost haunted the city. Letters arrived daily listing names of the fallen. Mothers, fathers, sons, husbands, friends. And the streets of Washington carried the weight of that grief. Inside the White House, tension had metastasized into paranoia. Mary Lincoln's fears no longer seemed strange. They seemed almost rational. She spoke. Of shadows at windows, of staff members who might be spies, of whispers in hallways that no one else could hear. Elizabeth, though trained to remain calm, felt her pulse quicken when Mary pulled her aside one evening, her hands trembling. "Elizabeth," she whispered, "there is someone in this house who does not want the president to live. Someone close. I can feel it. I can see it." Elizabeth forced her expression into neutrality, though her heart beat like a drum in her chest. "How do you answer a statement like that without betraying disbelief?" "I will be careful, Mrs. Lincoln," she said. "I will watch." Mary's eyes held desperation. "Keep your eyes open, Elizabeth. Do not trust anyone completely. Not even those who claim loyalty." The words were chilling. Elizabeth had heard rumors. She had seen glimpses. Notes slipped under doors. Strange behavior by staff. Hushed warnings whispered to the president. Yet never so direct, never so personal. The days that followed, Elizabeth noticed the little things. Servants arriving early. Items moved from one room to another with no explanation. Conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. She began keeping a mental ledger of each oddity, each anomaly, storing them for a day when knowledge might be a weapon, or a curse. The president's own demeanor had shifted. Lincoln remained composed for the public, but Elizabeth watched him closely. He moved more cautiously, pausing before opening letters. He greeted officials with warmth, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion and something sharper, a quiet vigilance. One afternoon, Elizabeth was called to adjust a gown in the East Room. Mary Lincoln appeared, frantic, holding a letter close to her chest. "I cannot show this to Abraham," she said. "He must not see it." Elizabeth's fingers worked mechanically on the hem, but her mind raced. "What is it, Mrs. Lincoln?" Mary shook her head violently. "Some secrets cannot be spoken aloud. But there are names here, Elizabeth. People who walk these halls who wish to see him dead. They are plotting, waiting." Elizabeth realized then the enormity of her position. She was no longer merely a dressmaker. She was a confidant, a protector, a silent witness to treachery that could topple the president himself. Every word she heard, every whisper she caught, was a thread in a web that could unravel the Union. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth became hyper-aware. She observed the staff, noting who lingered too long near documents, who lingered too briefly in hallways, who avoided her gaze. Her senses, honed by decades of survival, became weapons. And then came the day that confirmed her fears. A courier delivered a note to the president in private. He read it with a frown, then quickly folded it and handed it to Elizabeth. "Watch closely," he said. Elizabeth unfolded the paper. It contained a single warning: the next public event will be fatal. "Guard him. Watch all who approach." Elizabeth's stomach turned. She was reading not just a threat, but a blueprint for violence. And she had no authority to act. No one would listen if she raised alarms. She was still, in the eyes of Washington society, a servant. A woman who had once been a slave. Her words carried weight only because Mary Lincoln trusted her, and even then, that trust was fragile. Mary found her later that evening, eyes red from tears. "I cannot live like this," she said. "Every shadow looks like a blade. Every stranger looks like a conspirator." Elizabeth placed her hands lightly on Mary's shoulders. "You are safe here, Mrs. Lincoln. For now." But she knew it was not true. Safety in the White House was an illusion. Every day brought new dangers. Every interaction might hide betrayal. Every letter could conceal a threat. The tension escalated as summer approached. The Lincoln family moved carefully from room to room. Guards doubled their patrols. Visitors were screened. But the sense of dread did not leave. Elizabeth slept little, haunted by her own memories of slavery. She knew fear intimately. She had learned to anticipate violence before it arrived. She understood the way danger could linger unseen, waiting for a single lapse in attention. One night, she sat alone in her shop on 12th Street, stitching quietly by candlelight. Her fingers moved with precision, but her mind replayed the warnings she had seen. Every shadow in the White House hallway. Every whispered name. Every glance that lingered too long. She realized she was carrying more than thread and fabric. She carried the weight of knowledge that could topple empires. Secrets that could destroy the president, the First Lady, and perhaps the nation itself. Elizabeth understood that she could never speak these truths aloud. To do so would be dangerous beyond measure. She had already learned that history was written not by those who saw, but by those who survived. And survival required silence. When the president passed through her shop that evening, he paused near her, observing her with quiet curiosity. "You have been watching closely," he said. "Always, Mr. President," she replied. He nodded, a small smile crossing his tired face. It was not relief. It was acknowledgement, a recognition that someone else had noticed what he could not. Elizabeth understood the unspoken agreement. She would be his eyes in shadows, his guardian in silence, and no one else could know. As she closed the shop that night, Elizabeth felt the weight of what she had accepted. Fear, danger, secrets, responsibility, and she understood that the line between loyalty and survival was thinner than ever. If this story has gripped you, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who loves hidden history, and leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. In Part 6, the war invades the White House like never before, and Elizabeth witnesses horrors that will mark her forever. Some moments change a person forever. For Elizabeth Keckley, that moment arrived in the summer of 1864. Washington had grown stranger, darker. The war had reached its deadliest phase. Smoke from distant battles hung over the city like a permanent fog. Ambulances rattled through streets in the dead of night, carrying the wounded and the dying. The White House, once a symbol of home and comfort, now felt like a command post haunted by whispers and shadows. Elizabeth moved through the halls, her hands full of silk and thread, but her mind alert to every footstep, every door creak, every hurried whisper. She had learned to be invisible, to hear everything without being seen, to witness terror without showing it. And terror was everywhere. One afternoon, Mary Lincoln burst into her workshop, eyes wide, hands trembling. "Elizabeth," she said, "something terrible is happening. The papers, the letters, the people, they are all conspiring. I can feel it in my bones." Elizabeth's fingers froze on the fabric. "Tell me everything," she said. Mary leaned close, whispering as if the walls themselves might carry her words. "There are meetings in the corridors. Secret conversations. I hear whispers that speak of betrayal, of violence, of assassination. Some of them are people I have trusted. Some are people who serve us daily. They think no one notices." Elizabeth listened, filing every detail in her mind. She had seen fear before, but Mary's was different. It was not just personal. It was prophetic. That night, Elizabeth could not sleep. The streets outside were filled with soldiers, marching in uneasy silence. She thought of the president, of the First Lady, of the children. She thought of her own son, George, safe, far away, and of the years it had taken to earn their freedom. All of it could be lost in a single, violent instant. The next day, the danger became undeniable. Elizabeth was in the White House, making adjustments to one of Mary's gowns, when a servant she did not recognize entered the room. He lingered near the door, watching. Elizabeth felt the hair on the back of her neck rise. She had learned to sense threat before it arrived. "What do you need?" she asked, calm but firm. "Nothing," the man said, his eyes darting nervously. He left as quickly as he had appeared, but Elizabeth knew better. Something had been tested. Something had been observed. Days later, another note arrived, slipped under the door of the president's private office. Elizabeth found it first. The paper was folded with precision. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, threatening. It contained a single line: "The tyrant will fall." Elizabeth's stomach sank. She knew the weight of that message. She knew that history had not yet recorded the danger that surrounded the president. That note could have ended everything. Mary Lincoln noticed her pallor. "Elizabeth," she said, "do you see? Do you understand? They are everywhere. You must watch. You must protect." Elizabeth nodded, swallowing her fear. She understood. She would carry the burden. She had always carried burdens. Slavery had trained her for this. Fear had shaped her. Silence had become her armor. The weeks that followed were tense beyond imagination. Elizabeth watched the White House staff carefully, noting who avoided her gaze, who lingered too long, who seemed overly eager to please. She memorized faces, gestures, expressions. Every detail could be a clue. And then the unthinkable happened. It was a quiet morning in July. Elizabeth was adjusting a hem in Mary's chambers when a sharp cry echoed from the hallway. She rushed to see a young servant collapsed on the floor, clutching a letter covered in blood. The note had been poisoned. Not the paper, but the ink. A slow-acting toxin meant to incapacitate, to scare, to warn. Elizabeth realized instantly that the threat was no longer abstract. It was real, immediate, and lethal. Mary screamed. The president was summoned. Soldiers rushed in. Elizabeth held the young servant's hand as they carried him away, noting every detail, every suspicious figure in the hallway. She would remember them all. After the chaos, Elizabeth found Mary sitting on the edge of her bed, pale, trembling, yet desperate for calm. "You must stay, Elizabeth," she whispered. "You are the only one I trust." Elizabeth understood fully then. She was no longer just a dressmaker. She was a guardian, a witness, a shield for the most powerful family in America. And the price of that role was fear, constant vigilance, and the knowledge that one mistake could be fatal. The war pressed in on all sides. The city outside was filled with grief and rage. Soldiers returned from battlefields, bearing news of death, destruction, and betrayal. Newspapers printed accusations and rumors, some baseless, some terrifyingly accurate. Every day, Elizabeth felt the weight of secrets grow heavier. She began keeping her own ledger, not of stitches and hems, but of threats and warnings, whispers and omens. Each entry was a reminder of the fragility of life, of power, of trust. Then came the night Elizabeth would never forget. A fire broke out in the White House kitchens. Smoke filled the hallways. Panic spread. Elizabeth helped guide Mary and the children to safety, moving through flames and smoke, ignoring the heat and the danger. She watched the president coordinate the evacuation with calm authority, yet even his tall frame seemed diminished by the chaos. In the aftermath, Elizabeth realized something that would haunt her forever. Danger was not always visible. It could lurk in shadows, in notes, in whispers. It could hide behind faces that smiled politely. And it could strike without warning. The White House, she understood, was a place where history was being written in blood, in grief, in courage. And she, a woman who had once been a slave, stood at the center of it all, silent, unseen, yet indispensable. Elizabeth did not speak of the fire. She did not tell the newspapers. She did not tell anyone outside the walls. Some knowledge was too dangerous to share. And she had learned the most important rule of all. To survive, she must remain invisible. To protect, she must endure silently. To witness, she must remember every detail, every face, every threat, without ever letting it show. If this story grips you, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who loves hidden history, and leave a comment telling me where you are listening from. In Part 7, the threat becomes impossible to ignore, and Elizabeth discovers a secret that will shake the foundations of the White House forever. Part 7. There are moments in history when silence is louder than a scream. For Elizabeth Keckley, Part 7 of her life inside the White House became that silence. It was September of 1864, and Washington felt like a city holding its breath. The war raged on. Smoke drifted from distant battlefields like an invisible warning. Families received letters that never returned home. Fear had become routine, despair almost expected. Inside the White House, tension had reached a breaking point. Mary Lincoln's eyes darted constantly, searching for threats in the corners of every room. She refused to sleep more than a few hours a night. She spent days in her private chambers, writing letters she never sent, consulting mediums who promised to reveal conspiracies, scanning faces for treachery. Elizabeth, ever present, moved silently behind her, adjusting hems, pinning bodices, and listening to every whispered concern. She had long ago ceased to be just a dressmaker. She was confidant, guardian, and witness. The threads she sewed carried more than silk, they carried the weight of secrets that could topple governments. One evening, Mary pulled Elizabeth aside, her voice trembling with urgency. "Elizabeth, you must listen. This is more than letters and whispers now. I have seen it with my own eyes. There are men in this house plotting not just to ruin Abraham, but to kill him." Elizabeth's heart sank. She had suspected it, heard the shadows, felt the tension, but Mary's words made it concrete. How do you protect someone from a threat you cannot name? How do you prevent a crime that has not yet occurred? Elizabeth did not know, but she had no choice. She must act, silently, always silently. In the days that followed, Elizabeth observed everyone more closely than ever. Every visitor, every staff member, every delivery. She memorized their patterns, their gestures, their faces. The tiniest deviation became a warning signal. And then she discovered something that chilled her blood. While assisting Mary with a new gown in the East Room, Elizabeth found a note hidden in a drawer used by White House clerks. The handwriting was jagged, hurried. The words were terrifyingly direct. Tonight he will be vulnerable. Guard him. Watch every approach. Elizabeth folded the note carefully, hiding it in her apron. She did not show it to anyone. She could not. Some knowledge was too dangerous to share. Even the president could be destabilized by knowing that death waited within his own home. The days became a relentless game of observation. Elizabeth traced each footstep, counted each visitor, listened to every whisper in the corridors. She learned to move like a shadow herself, silent, unnoticed, always alert. One afternoon, as she adjusted a bodice in Mary's chambers, she overheard a conversation in the hall. Two men spoke in low voices, unaware she was near. He cannot survive the night, one said. If he lives, everything falls apart, the other replied. Elizabeth's hands stilled on the fabric. The threat was real, imminent. She felt the same fear she had once felt as a girl on a plantation, when a misstep could cost her life. But she also felt resolve. She could not stop the war, she could not stop bullets on distant fields, but she could protect the man inside the White House. That night, Elizabeth stayed late. She moved silently through hallways, checking doors, observing staff, ensuring that nothing went unnoticed. Mary slept in her chambers, oblivious to the quiet vigilance surrounding her. And then came the revelation that would haunt Elizabeth forever. She discovered a hidden passage used by servants to move discreetly between rooms. It was narrow, dark, almost forgotten. And it had been used to move messages, packages, and perhaps threats, into spaces where the president was most vulnerable. Elizabeth followed the passage alone, heart pounding. The air smelled of dust, candle wax, and something older, darker. The walls seemed to close in. And then she saw it. A small trapdoor, hidden behind a curtain of velvet. The note had come from there. Someone had been inside the White House, in secret, close enough to strike. She realized then the true horror of her position. Elizabeth was no longer just a witness. She was in the middle of a conspiracy. Every smile, every polite greeting, could mask deadly intent. Every shadow could hide a dagger. Elizabeth made a choice. She would continue to observe, continue to protect, continue to live in silence. She would not speak of the passage, the notes, the whispers. To do so would invite suspicion, chaos, perhaps even death. The days stretched on, each one heavier than the last. Elizabeth moved through the White House like a phantom, invisible to most, essential to few, carrying secrets too dangerous to share. Mary Lincoln grew more desperate, more fearful, more reliant on Elizabeth's calm presence. She spoke of mediums, of visions, of warnings from spirits. Elizabeth did not laugh. She did not judge. She simply listened, adjusted hymns, and ensured that the First Lady remained as safe as possible. The president noticed her attention. "You watch closely," he said one afternoon, eyes sharp but tired. "Always, Mr. President," she replied, without hesitation. He nodded, as if that simple acknowledgement carried understanding. Elizabeth knew it did. She had always understood the weight of vigilance, of survival, of silence. That night, as she walked home along 12th Street, Elizabeth felt the enormity of what she had accepted. Danger stalked the White House. Betrayal could be anywhere. Death waited patiently. And she, a woman who had once been enslaved, was the silent guardian of the most powerful family in America. She also knew that her role would only grow darker, more complicated, more impossible to bear. The threads she stitched were no longer just fabric. They were strands of protection, threads of survival woven through a house that seemed to tremble under the weight of history itself. If this story has gripped you, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who loves hidden history, and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. In Part 8, the danger erupts fully inside the White House, and Elizabeth faces a moment that will test her courage, her skill, and her ability to remain silent under unimaginable pressure. Part 8. Some nights are darker than others. Some nights bring a fear that is sharp, immediate, and impossible to ignore. For Elizabeth Keckley, that night came. In the autumn of 1864. The White House had become more than a home. It was a battlefield. Every room held tension. Every corridor carried secrets. The war outside had been fierce, but inside, danger was quiet, deliberate, invisible. Elizabeth moved carefully through the halls, her hands adjusting fabric and her mind scanning shadows. She had learned to be invisible, to observe without being seen. But on this night, she realized that invisibility was not enough. Mary Lincoln appeared suddenly in her workshop, her eyes wild, her hands trembling as she clutched a letter. "Elizabeth," she whispered, "it has arrived. They are coming. I can feel it. I know who it is." Elizabeth's heart pounded. "Who, Mrs. Lincoln?" she asked, steadying her voice. "I do not know," Mary admitted. "But I feel their presence. They have moved through this house before. I can hear them in my sleep. They watch, they wait. And tonight they will act." Elizabeth swallowed her fear. She understood. This was no longer a warning. This was a threat, immediate and lethal. The president was in the study, reviewing reports. Soldiers patrolled the halls outside. Guards were stationed at every entrance. Yet Elizabeth knew instinctively that danger could slip through the cracks. She moved silently, checking doors, windows, and stairways. Every footstep, every whisper, every shadow was recorded in her mind. She had become more than a dressmaker. She was a sentinel, a protector, a witness to a conspiracy that could kill the president. Then the noise began. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. A creak of floorboards, a soft shuffle in a distant corridor. Elizabeth froze, her fingers clutching the hem of Mary's gown. Mary appeared behind her, whispering, "Do you hear it?" Elizabeth nodded, her eyes scanning the room. The sound grew louder. It was deliberate, calculated, someone moving with intent. Elizabeth realized that the intruder was inside the White House. She led Mary quietly to a side room, closing the door gently behind them. The First Lady's hands shook in hers. "Stay calm," Elizabeth whispered. "We will get through this." The intruder moved closer. Elizabeth could hear the subtle shift of weight on the wooden floor. Her mind raced. Every lesson she had learned as a slave, every skill she had honed as a dressmaker, every ounce of courage she had gathered over decades now mattered. She had to remain unseen. She had to remain silent. Suddenly, the door handle rattled. Elizabeth held her breath. Mary's eyes were wide, terrified, but she trusted Elizabeth completely. Elizabeth moved forward, her body pressed against the wall, listening, calculating, waiting for the right moment. A shadow appeared in the doorway. Elizabeth froze. She could see the outline of a man, cautious, deliberate, armed. He stepped into the room. Elizabeth's mind worked quickly. She could not confront him directly. She could not call for help. She had only one option. She needed to misdirect, to manipulate, to survive. Using a small bolt of fabric she had brought into the room, Elizabeth created a subtle distraction. She threw it across the room, and it landed near a chair with a soft crash. The intruder turned instinctively, and Elizabeth took the opportunity to slip behind a heavy curtain, pulling Mary with her. They held their breath as the man searched, his footsteps deliberate, his hands moving cautiously over furniture, over drawers, over walls. He muttered something under his breath, and Elizabeth realized he was looking for something specific. A document, a note, a piece of information that could destroy the president. Elizabeth's mind raced. She had seen threats before. Letters, poisoned ink, hidden passages. But this was different. This was an immediate, violent attempt to strike. And she was powerless if she failed. The intruder moved closer to the curtain. Elizabeth could see the edge of his boots. She could feel the air shift as he brushed past the heavy fabric. Her heart pounded in her chest, yet she did not move. She could not. Any motion would give them away. And then, almost miraculously, he left. The footsteps receded. The creak of the floorboards faded. Silence returned, thick and suffocating. Elizabeth waited, holding Mary close, until the danger had passed. When the First Lady finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Elizabeth, he could have killed us." "I know," Elizabeth said, her voice steady though her hands shook. "But he did not. And we are alive." That night, Elizabeth understood something she had long known but had never fully faced. Knowledge is power. Silence is protection. Vigilance is survival. And some dangers cannot be confronted directly. They can only be endured, watched, and survived. She sat with Mary long after the intruder had gone, calming her, listening to her fears, and ensuring she understood that safety was possible, even when danger was real. Outside, the city carried on. Soldiers marched, messengers delivered letters, the war raged on. But inside the White House, history had been shaped not by generals or politicians, but by a woman who had once been a slave, whose courage, skill, and vigilance had kept a family alive through the darkest night. Elizabeth did not speak of the incident to anyone. She would not write it in letters. She would not recount it to historians. Some knowledge, she understood, was too dangerous to share. Some secrets had to die with those who carried them. And so she returned to her work, her hands steady, her eyes alert, her mind sharper than ever. She was not just a dressmaker. She was a sentinel, a protector, a keeper of secrets that could have destroyed the President and the First Lady if exposed. If this story has gripped you, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who loves hidden history, and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. In Part 9, Elizabeth faces a tragedy that will haunt the White House forever, and the cost of silence becomes painfully clear. Part 9, Some nights leave marks that never fade. For Elizabeth Keckley, Part 9 would be one of those nights. It was April 1865. The air in Washington was thick with anxiety and fear. The war had raged for 4 long years, leaving the country battered, grieving, and exhausted. Smoke from battlefields far away still drifted toward the city, mixing with the smell of coal fires and the heavy perfume of the White House. Inside, the tension had reached a breaking point. Soldiers moved through the streets in uneasy silence. Messages came and went in hurried hands. The city seemed on edge, as if it knew a storm was coming. Elizabeth had grown accustomed to the danger. She had seen threats slip silently through the White House, intruders who moved like shadows, and letters filled with coded warnings that could topple governments. But nothing she had witnessed before could have prepared her for what was coming. That evening, she was in Mary Lincoln's chambers, fitting a gown for an evening reception. Mary seemed quieter than usual, her face pale, her eyes distant. She moved with the careful grace of someone trying to hold herself together, trying to keep the world at bay. Elizabeth adjusted a sleeve, her mind alert to every creak in the floorboards, every whisper in the hallway. She had learned to anticipate danger, but she had not learned to anticipate the weight of grief. A knock at the door. Elizabeth turned slightly. A servant entered with a note. The handwriting was familiar, official. It was urgent. The President had been invited to Ford's Theater that evening for a performance of Our American Cousin. He was expected to attend despite the ongoing tensions in the city. Elizabeth felt a chill. Something about the message unsettled her. Her instincts screamed that this night would be different. That it would not end with applause or polite conversation. The hours passed. Elizabeth moved quietly through the White House, ensuring that Mary was safe and comfortable, that the children were tended to, that every precaution was taken. Every moment, her mind raced with what-ifs, with possibilities that were darker than anyone could imagine. At the theater, the crowd laughed and clapped, oblivious to the shadow that had entered the building with the President. Elizabeth had no way of knowing that a man with a loaded pistol had been waiting for the perfect moment. Back at the White House, she felt the unease settle into her chest like a stone. Something had shifted in the air. A dread she could not explain. She busied herself with her work, but her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed fabric over the table. And then came the news. The shot rang out. The sound carried through the city, across the Potomac, across streets and alleys, through homes and businesses. President Abraham Lincoln had been shot. Elizabeth's hands fell from the fabric. The room seemed to tilt around her. She did not scream. She did not move. She understood immediately that the world had changed, and that nothing would ever be the same again. Mary Lincoln's scream pierced the walls of the White House, a sound so raw, so full of grief, that Elizabeth felt it as if it had struck her own heart. She ran to her side, holding her hands, whispering calm, steady words that she did not fully believe. "He is gone," Mary said, her voice breaking in ways Elizabeth had never heard. "He is dead." Elizabeth did not cry. There was no time for that. Her role had become even more urgent. She had to be the anchor, the witness, the protector of what remained. She had to hold Mary together when the world itself had shattered. In the days that followed, Elizabeth watched the White House transform into a house of mourning. Every room carried the weight of despair. Staff whispered behind closed doors. Newspapers filled the city with speculation and accusation. The threat of political chaos hung over every action, every decision, every breath. Mary Lincoln became fragile, wandering the halls, consulting mediums, speaking to spirits, trying to contact her lost son and now her husband. Elizabeth followed silently, adjusting gowns, soothing nerves, listening to fears, recording every detail in her mind that could be useful, every sign that needed to be watched. Elizabeth also witnessed moments that the public would never know. She saw Mary clutching the president's coat, whispering apologies and confessions into the fabric. She saw her kneeling by the window, staring at the street below as if the ghosts of the past and present were calling to her. She saw the despair, the guilt, the love, the terror that no historian could ever truly capture. And through it all, Elizabeth carried her own grief. She had known the president personally. She had seen him in moments of fear, of despair, of humanity that the public would never witness. She had watched him bear the weight of a nation, and now he was gone, leaving behind a country on the brink, a first lady shattered, and a world that felt suddenly empty and cold. Her mind returned to the lessons of her life. Silence had been survival. Vigilance had been protection. Knowledge had been power. She would continue to hold the secrets she had gathered, the threats she had witnessed, the fears she had recorded. Some truths were too dangerous to share. Some horrors had to be contained, kept within the walls of memory. Elizabeth moved through the funeral preparations, her hands steady as she arranged clothing, her voice calm as she reassured Mary, her eyes sharp as she observed every person entering the White House. She understood that danger did not end with a death. Threats lingered. Power vacuums created chaos. Conspiracies continued to weave their threads. And yet, amidst the horror, Elizabeth also saw resilience. She saw the courage of a first lady who, despite her grief, continued to navigate a world filled with enemies, critics, and the ghosts of her family. She saw the determination of staff who refused to leave, who held the household together when it threatened to fall apart. She saw, in herself, the strength that had carried her from slavery to freedom, from invisibility to indispensability. Elizabeth understood then what her life had always been. Not just a story of survival. Not just a story of sewing and fashion. But a story of bearing witness. Of carrying the weight of history, of grief, of secrets too dangerous to be spoken aloud. She had been the invisible eye, the silent guardian, the steady hand in moments that shaped the nation. If this story has gripped you, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who loves hidden history, and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. In Part 10, the final chapter, Elizabeth must face the aftermath of tragedy, the cost of silence, and the secrets that will haunt her for the rest of her life. Part 10 Final Part. Some stories are too powerful to end quietly. Some secrets demand to be carried, even if the world never knows their full weight. For Elizabeth Keckley, this was the final chapter. It was the spring of 1865, and Washington was still reeling from the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. The city moved with a sense of cautious fear, as though every shadow might conceal danger. Every street, every building, every whispered conversation seemed charged with the memory of what had just happened. Elizabeth returned to the White House after the funeral, her hands steady but her heart heavy. She had witnessed the unimaginable. She had seen grief that could shatter a nation and the fragility of power itself. And now, she carried a secret that would remain hers alone, a knowledge of moments no historian would record, of dangers narrowly avoided, of horrors silently endured. Mary Lincoln wandered the halls, her eyes vacant, her mind adrift in a world that had lost her husband. Elizabeth followed closely, her hands ready to adjust gowns, calm nerves, and offer silent comfort. She had become indispensable, not because she sewed the finest dresses, but because she could be trusted with a First Lady's darkest fears. Elizabeth knew the power of her silence. Every conversation she had heard, every whispered warning, every secret betrayal, was information that could destroy reputations, topple governments, or ruin lives. And she had chosen, from the very beginning, to hold it all close, to be invisible, to survive and protect those who could not protect themselves. The weeks passed. Congress debated Reconstruction. The city mourned. Soldiers returned home. Mary Lincoln consulted mediums and held seances, speaking to spirits of the past and trying to find solace for the dead. Elizabeth never judged. She listened, she guided, she ensured that Mary remained alive and functional, even when her grief threatened to undo her completely. And through it all, Elizabeth kept the knowledge she had gathered for years. The intruders in the White House, the conspiracies, the plots against the president, the moments of despair and doubt that Abraham Lincoln had shared with her, moments so intimate and human that they could have shattered his legacy if revealed. She knew what power could do. She knew the world was not ready for the full truth. One night, alone in her small shop on 12th Street, Elizabeth reflected on her life. She remembered being a girl on a Virginia plantation, her hands scarred from punishment, her mind sharpened by necessity. She remembered every stitch she had sewn, every dollar she had earned to buy her freedom and her son's. She remembered entering Washington as a free woman, navigating a city that looked at her with suspicion and curiosity, building a reputation that could transcend color, but never fully escape it. And she remembered the White House, the laughter, the sorrow, the whispered secrets, the moments when the president's humanity had shone brighter than any public speech, the moments when Mary Lincoln's grief had been so raw it felt like it could consume the building itself. Elizabeth understood then what she had always known. History was not only made by battles and speeches. It was made in private rooms, in whispered confidences, in the courage of people who survived when others could not. She had survived. She had witnessed, and she would carry it all for the rest of her life. She also knew the cost. The world would never fully appreciate her role. She would never receive public recognition for the protection she had provided, for the vigilance she had maintained, for the secrets she had kept. She would not write them in letters, she would not publish them, she would not speak of them, not even to friends she trusted. Some truths were too dangerous, too powerful, too capable of destruction to ever see the light of day. And so, Elizabeth went on, sewing, adjusting hems, guiding Mary Lincoln through grief, holding the first family together with invisible hands. She became a legend in silence, a witness to history that the world would never fully know. She published her memoir, Behind the Scenes, in 1868, revealing glimpses of her life and her work, but even that account carefully avoided the most dangerous knowledge she had carried. Copies were systematically destroyed, critics attacked her, and she spent the remainder of her life quietly, deliberately, and meticulously guarding the secrets she had acquired. Elizabeth Keckley lived another 40 years after the war, refusing interviews, declining offers to speak publicly, and carrying with her the weight of knowledge that could have changed history. When she died in 1907, those secrets died with her. The conspiracies she had witnessed, the plots she had intercepted, the despair and doubt of a president, the grief and paranoia of a first lady, the dangers she had quietly prevented, all were gone, locked forever in a mind that had proven itself capable of bearing the impossible. She had been a slave. She had bought her freedom. She had risen to a place of influence, invisibility, and trust. She had witnessed the intimate, horrifying, and human side of power. And she had survived. Elizabeth Keckley's story is more than the story of a dressmaker. It is the story of courage, of vigilance, of the quiet strength that shapes history behind the scenes. It is the story of someone who understood that survival sometimes requires silence, that protection sometimes requires invisibility, and that the greatest horrors and the greatest truths are often the ones no one ever sees. If you have followed Elizabeth's journey through this series, you have glimpsed moments of history that have been hidden for over a century. You have seen the White House not only as a symbol of power but as a place of fear, grief, and secrecy. You have witnessed the humanity of people who changed a nation while carrying unimaginable burdens. If you are fascinated by stories of hidden history, subscribe to this channel, share it with someone who loves uncovering secrets from the past. And leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. Elizabeth Keckley's story may have ended over a century ago, but her courage, her resilience, and the secrets she held continue to echo in the hidden corridors of history. History is never only what is written. Sometimes, it lives in silence. Sometimes, it lives in the hands of those brave enough to survive. Elizabeth Keckley was one of them.